So the next chapter is on learning and memory. We'll do them both separately though. Learning is the brain-based relatively permanent change in behavior that results from experience, reinforcement, or observation. The last three words, experience, reinforcement, or observation, are the three main schools of learning, which include classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory. So classical conditioning was founded in 1904 by Ivan Pavlov, and it's a process in which the environment, E, elicits a response out of the organism, O. It involves primarily visceral responses that we essentially have little control of, and establishes very quickly and extinguishes very slowly. You see these things in like food aversion and phobias. You probably recall a famous experiment with little Albert, who was classically conditioned to be afraid of masks and other things. Operant conditioning was founded in the 1930s by B.F. Skinner and involves primarily a process of the organism emitting a response on the environment. So it's backwards, and it involves primarily motor or skeletal muscle responses. These establish quickly and extinguish quickly depending on the schedule of reinforcement, and are seen not only in clinical situations but also in work situations. Social learning theory was founded in the 1970s by Albert Bandura, but was influenced by people like Julian Roeder and others. It involves primarily the process in which the organism learns by imitation or observation. So there's no evidence that the person actually knows the behavior until a later date. Social learning theory happens quickly, and it's involved in many human learning processes that are very complex, like language and motor skills. So when a child learns to speak, they learn to speak by watching adult models doing it. So Pavlov developed classical conditioning, and it involves three phases: the preconditioned phase, the proof phase, and the pairing phase. So in the preconditioned phase, that'd be box 1, before conditioning happens, food, an unconditioned stimulus, produces an unconditioned response. So if you present food to a hungry dog, it'll salivate. It doesn't take any learning. The other precondition is that, number 2, that if you blow a whistle, all that happens to the animal is either no conditioned response or an orienting response. So that's phase 1, preconditions. Phase 2 is the pairing phase. That would be box 3. During the pairing phase, the whistle and the food are connected together, and it produces a salivating response or an unconditioned response. Phase 4 is the proof phase, where you present the whistle all by itself, and the unconditioned stimulus or neutral stimulus, the whistle, now becomes a conditioned stimulus if it produces salivating in the dog. So the unconditioned response now becomes a conditioned response. And it's that quickly, it can happen that quickly. So acquisition is a process by which the conditioned response is established or strengthened. Extinction is the dying out of it. So if you present the whistle all by itself and don't keep presenting the food, eventually the unconditioned response or conditioned response will stop. Although, oddly enough, if you extinguish the response and then after some delay of time go back and into the same paradigm and blow the whistle, you might find that the dog salivates. That's called spontaneous recovery. So there's evidence that, in fact, once the organism establishes the learning, it creates a brain circuit, which is awfully hard to overcome, as anyone who knows about phobias can attest to. Stimulus generalization is the extension of a conditioned response from the training stimulus to similar ones. So, for example, people who are phobic of spiders often are phobic of all spiders, not just one particular type. But if they are, then it's stimulus discrimination, making different responses to different stimuli that have been followed by different measures. I mentioned little Albert earlier. In little Albert's experiment, John Watson and Dr. Rayner, presented a toddler with a white rat and this is in a stage demonstration. So the neutral stimulus in that paradigm was the white rat. What he didn't know, what little Albert didn't know, was behind the stage, Watson had pipes and hammers with some henchmen who would, on his cue, would, when he presented the rat, would make a clatter and frighten the child. So the loud noise produced an unconditioned response of fear. When he paired them together, and then later on brought the rat out by itself, they were able to demonstrate, not only with the rat, but with masks and other things, that conditioned responses happen very quickly. The last point I wanted to make was temporal contiguity. That is that if you present these things, they have to be not only in the same place, but over in a short period of time. So for example, if you eat something and get sick right away, you likely won't eat that. If you drink something, start drinking alcohol, for example, and don't vomit till 8 or 10 hours later, you may not make the connection, and you may continue to keep drinking. In fact, psychologists and physicians use a drug called antabuse, that when a person ingests alcohol, it makes them sick immediately. And of course, that's the treatment for, one of the treatments for alcohol abuse. Classical conditioning is seen in all kinds of things besides phobias, like habit control, as I just mentioned, with alcohol or with smoking. And it's also seen in advertising. So the conditioning stimulus that they pair products with include humor and sex and other things that make a visceral connection between the product and your emotional states. And here is Pavlov's paradigm with his dog hooked up. So what they discovered was that at the appearance of the people in white lab coats or hearing noises, the dogs actually started salivating before they got food. It was almost as if they were anticipating being fed. The second paradigm is called operant conditioning, and it's based on Edward Thorndike's law of effect, which basically says if you do something and it feels good, you'll keep doing it. If you do something and it feels bad, you'll stop doing it. And it's all based on the idea of reinforcements. So one of the questions in the study sheet is, what's the difference between punishments and reinforcements? Reinforcements always increase the probability of behavior, regardless of whether they're positive or negative. Punishments always decrease the probability of behavior, again, regardless of whether they're positive or negative. The positive and negative has to do with whether it's applied, that would be a positive reinforcement or a positive punishment. And negative reinforcements are things that are withheld, which would be a negative reinforcement or a negative punishment. So timeout, for example, is a negative reinforcement because you're withholding social interaction with the child, which is what the child wants to do. And the goal of negative reinforcement is to increase appropriate play behavior. Most of Skinner's work was done on when he developed this thing called the Skinner box. So the Skinner box, you'll notice there's a rat in there and there's a lever, signal lights, a speaker, and an electrified floor. So basically what Skinner did was deprive the rat of food. He was hungry, put him in the box, so he hasn't eaten for a day, and he smells food. You notice there's holes in the top of the Skinner box. He can smell that there's food somewhere. And he's hungry, so he's curious and wandering around the box, and he inadvertently touches the lever, and a food pellet comes out in the food dispenser. He eats the reinforcement and goes back and continues to eat until he's not hungry anymore. So we've established or acquired the learning. If you do it again a day later or 2 days later, the first thing he'll do when he gets in there, because he's still hungry, is he'll go right over to the bar. So if you don't give him food pellets in the same situation, now he'll continue to press the bar, but eventually will stop. And that's called extinction. Same terms from classical conditioning. If you only give him a food pellet when he presses the bar and the blue light's on, then he will be learning to discriminate. If you give him a food pellet when any light's on, then he'll generalize. So people that learn all how to drive a 5-speed can generalize their learning to other situations based on the fact that they're very similar. When you have a bank of light switches at home with 4 or 5 switches on it, you discriminate quickly the one that turns the stairway light on because you've used it over and over again. So we can change it just a little bit and talk about positive and negative reinforcements. So the food pellet would actually be a positive reinforcement because it's strengthening behavior and it's being applied. If we change it just a little bit, and now we're going to, when he doesn't know this yet, the rat doesn't know this yet, but when the light comes on, let's say the red light, in 5 seconds he's going to get shocked. Okay, so obviously not killing the rat, but startling the rat. And the way he turns the shock off is to press the bar down. Okay, so the first time this happens, he's got 5 seconds between the red light going on and pressing the bar. The first couple of times he's not going to make the connection, but he'll eventually learn that when the light comes on, he needs to press the bar to turn off the electric shock. The electric shock would be a negative reinforcement. Okay. So operant conditioning, operant reinforcements is the process of changing behavior following response with a reinforcement. We talked about stimulus generalization, that the more similar they are, the more likely you are to respond in the same way. And of course, stimulus discrimination is just the opposite of that. Shaping occurs when you want to have a target behavior, but you need to reinforce successive approximations or getting closer and closer to the target. So let's say you're a speech therapist who's working with a stroke patient who is learning to articulate words. You're going to use verbal reinforcements, positive reinforcements, strengthen the behavior, but of course the person can't articulate the words yet. And the closer they get to it, the stronger and stronger and the more likely you are to reinforce appropriate approximations to that. Chaining, of course, occurs by teaching a complex behavior, but generally it's done backwards. So if you want to teach a child to tie a shoe, you break it into 5 or 6 steps. Of course, the last one is cinching up the bunny ears together, and you do the first 5 steps, they do the last one, and then you clap for them, which would be a positive reinforcement. And then once they learn that, you go to step 5, and you do step 5, let them do step 5, and of course, the opportunity to engage in step 6 is the reinforcement. It's a way of teaching complex tasks to children and to other people. Punishments, of course, decrease the probability of behavior. So a parking ticket is a punishment. A spanking is a punishment because the whole goal of it is to reduce whatever the target behavior is. And avoidance learning, as I mentioned with the Skinner box, occurs if the response leads to escape or turning the light off to avoid a painful stimulus, like getting shocked. Premack's principle is interesting. It's just the opportunity to engage in frequent behavior like eating can be a reinforcement to things like lever pressing. So if something you're more likely to do, if you pair that with something you're less likely to do, the learning happens more quickly. One of the things that Skinner was noted for was his schedules of reinforcement, basically believing that with the right reinforcements and the right schedules you can train anything. He also talks about the difference between continuous and intermittent schedules. So if you're trying to teach a behavior, a continuous schedule is more effective than an intermittent schedule. They learn quicker. If you want them to persist, though, an intermittent schedule is far better because once the continuous schedule is child is stops getting reinforcements, they just give up. So the idea is that if you want resistance to extinction, then you need to use an intermittent schedule as opposed to a continuous schedule. Schedules are used all the time in teaching behaviors. And they can either fix or vary the schedule, or you can fix or vary the interval, that is the passage of time. if you want to know more about schedules of reinforcement, you need to take a learning class. The last one is social learning theory, and that basically, as I mentioned earlier, is you learn from observing other people and imagining what the consequences would be if you did the behavior. So most people that have never changed a tire at least have the understanding of how to do that because they've seen somebody else doing it, even though they've never been reinforced or actually done it themselves. This is all based on Bandura's work with Bobo, the inflatable doll. Basically, children either watched an adult model punching the doll, or a videotape of an adult model punching a doll, or a non-violent videotape, and they discovered that in both the live model and the videotape of the adult hitting the doll, they imitated what they saw. And so we become what we observe. Self-efficacy, I think, is one of the questions on the study sheet, and that's the perception that if I think I can perform something, it's more likely to help me actually perform the behavior, within limits though. Doing something that's not in your skill set at all, making believe or believing that you can actually do it isn't going to make that happen, but it can affect performance positively, and it can affect performance negatively.